Hi, my name is Danielle, but everyone calls me Dani for short, and right now is definitely not a good time for me. My dad was glancing at me through the rearview mirror with that typical condescending look of his, telling me to smile so I would not make them feel bad. I rolled my eyes, sarcastically telling him that I was just thrilled to be sent away far out of their sight. My mom chimed in from the seat next to me, telling me not to get them wrong because I was going to love this school, before looking over at my dad for backup. He agreed instantly, bragging that it was a prestigious school for children from wealthy families, and reminding me how much he and my mom loved their time at Kingsbury. I shot back with a sarcastic tone, telling them it was only great because it suited them, but I was nothing like either of them. My mom leaned close, her voice soft yet chilling, warning me that one day I would thank them for keeping me off the street. Crossing my arms and frowning deeply, I felt my skin crawl from that arrogant tone they always use. As much as I hated the thought of being locked up in some ancient boarding school, part of me realized I could really use a break from my parents. Before I go any further, I should probably explain how I ended up in this nightmare. It was actually pretty simple. Back at my old public high school, I saw a big, arrogant bully pushing my friend around in the parking lot one afternoon. To teach him a lesson he would never forget, I sliced his car tires right in front of his face. But instead of seeing it as standing up for a friend, my parents called it a wild act of rebellion and decided to ship me off to a strict boarding school as a punishment. When our car finally pulled up to the gates of Kingsbury early that morning, I peered out the window and temporarily forgot how miserable I was supposed to be. The school looked like a massive medieval castle with towers stretching so high into the foggy clouds that it felt like stepping straight into Hogwarts. For a fleeting second, a tiny spark of hope flickered inside me, making me think that maybe my future here would not be so terrible after all. Unfortunately, that faint hope shattered the moment we walked into the principal's office. Mr. Hooper, the principal, was sitting behind his mahogany desk alongside Mrs. Bell, the strict dorm warden. It was obvious Mr. Hooper had already flipped through my disciplinary file and completely made up his mind about what kind of person I was. He looked at my parents and assured them that their school maintained a reputation for strict discipline for a reason, claiming that students like me stood to benefit the most from their harsh environment. I rolled my eyes in pure frustration. This was definitely not the fresh start I had pictured in my mind. After the meeting, Mrs. Bell led me down a cold, echoing hallway before stopping right outside room 237. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, and a bubbly girl opened it with a bright smile. She introduced herself as Cassandra, telling me I could call her Cass, and warmly welcomed me to Kingsbury as she held out her hand. I shook it rather awkwardly, quietly introducing myself as Dani. Mrs. Bell glared at me, firmly stating that I would be under Cassandra's strict supervision outside of school hours, adding that Cass was a model student who had been there long enough to know there was no way around their strict rule. I frowned to myself, annoyed that they were assigning the ultimate teacher's pet to babysit me. Exactly what I needed. Living with Cass turned out to be even more unbearable than I had anticipated. She was constantly hovering around my side of the room, using silly excuses like looking for her lost belongings, just so she could touch and peek through my personal things. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was snooping around my desk whenever I stepped out. A mischievous smirk spread across my face as an idea struck me. I pulled out a plain notebook and sat down at my desk, intentionally shielding my handwriting from her curious gaze. Cass strained her neck, making a hilariously confused face like Mr. Bean as she tried to catch a glimpse of what I was scribbling. On the outside, it looked like a totally normal private diary, but inside, I let my imagination run wild. I wrote elaborate stories about sneaking a water bottle full of vodka into class, collecting nasty bedbugs to dump into Cass's bed, and running a secret business selling math cheat sheets to desperate students. Unable to read a single word, Cass eventually huffed out of the room in pure frustration. Of course, I had no actual intention of doing any of those crazy things, but I thought my nosy roommate deserved a little entertainment. I could not help but giggle to myself. By the very next evening, Cass's frantic behavior completely confirmed that she had taken the bait and read every word. I sat on my bed watching her frantically strip the sheets off her mattress, examining every single corner of her bedding with wide, anxious eyes before stuffing them into a laundry hamper. Trying hard to suppress a burst of laughter, I asked her if everything was okay. Cass jumped nervously, her voice trembling as she claimed that everything was totally fine, and that she just felt like washing her bedding, pleading with me not to mind. I giggled under my breath, telling myself that I definitely believed her story. It did not take long to realize that Kingsbury had strict, absurd rules for literally everything imaginable. It felt like I managed to break half of them during my first 2 weeks just by existing. What made it 10 times worse was that the harsh punishments never fit the minor offenses. One night, I ended up stuck high on a library ladder, forced to reshelve hundreds of heavy hardcover books simply because I missed the 8 o'clock curfew while studying right inside that very library. Another time, I was forced to scrub the entire dining hall floor for a whole week just because the corner of my shirt happened to come untucked for a split second. On top of all that, Miss Bell seemed to possess a supernatural ability to watch everyone's every move everywhere all at once. One quiet afternoon, I was sitting comfortably on my bed, flipping through a copy of Teen Vogue. Out of nowhere, Mrs. Bell strutted into the room like a hawk, snatched the fashion magazine straight out of my hands, and confiscated it on the spot. I sat there in total shock, wondering how on earth I was supposed to know that a simple fashion magazine was considered dangerous contraband in this place. That magazine offense ended up being punishable by cleaning every single bronze candle holder in the school church. I spent hours wiping down melted wax, frowning in pure annoyance, and asking myself if this place could possibly get any more constricting. Did the administration really expect us to entertain ourselves by staring at the clouds like patients in an asylum? With literally zero fun allowed anywhere, it was no surprise that everyone here walked around looking like mindless zombies. As I scrubbed away, someone tapped me gently on the shoulder. I turned around to see a stylish girl smiling down at me. She introduced herself as Caroline, saying she heard I was the new school rebel named Danielle, and suggested we ditch this boring place to go have some real fun. I shook my head, telling her no thanks because I had already gotten into enough trouble. Caroline brushed it off, telling me it was fine, then turned to a quiet boy who happened to be walking past us. She callously barked at him, telling him to finish up my chore for me. The absolute nerve of this girl blew my mind. Boiling with irritation, I looked her straight in the eye and told her absolutely not, adding that she could not just boss people around like that. Caroline looked annoyed, telling me to drop the self-righteous act, and claiming there was no need to pretend I cared about dorks. I stood my ground, telling her I was fine right where I was and pointing out that he was definitely not the dork here. She huffed in frustration, telling me she thought I was cool before storming off down the aisle. I rolled my eyes, wondering what her problem was. The quiet boy stepped closer, thanking me warmly for standing up for him. He introduced himself as Ian and asked what absurd, trivial mistake I must have made to get stuck with such a mind-numbing task. We ended up chatting and laughing, making fun of Kingsbury's ridiculous rules together, while I finished cleaning the rest of the candle holder. For the first time since my miserable arrival, I felt like someone actually saw the real me. Suddenly, life at this school did not feel quite so unbearable anymore. However, Caroline was clearly not used to being rejected, and she immediately set out to make my life a living hell. The very next morning, she teamed up with a group of mean girls, link arm in a tight line to block the entire hallway right before the morning bell rang. Because I could not squeeze past them, I ended up getting scolded severely by Mrs. Bell for being late and for running down the corridor trying to make it to class. When she was not trying to get me sent to detention, Caroline was actively trying to humiliate me in front of everyone. During lunch in the crowded dining hall, she sneaked under my table and stealthily tied my shoelaces together. The moment I stood up to clear my tray, I tripped over my own feet and crashed face first onto the hard floor. It was infuriating, and as much as I desperately wanted to get back at her, I knew that any kind of retaliation would just land me in even deeper trouble with the school authority. The only peaceful, happy moments I had were the ones I spent with Ian. One afternoon, he led me down a hidden corridor and showed me a spacious entertainment room, packed with gaming tables and a complete home theater setup. I stared around the room, asking him in disbelief how I had never known about these amazing areas before. Ian explained that this was the entertainment center, pointing out the window to show me an Olympic-sized swimming pool and a lush croquet field. He noted that while it all looked incredible, students were almost never allowed to actually use any of it, adding that he sometimes felt those facilities existed purely to impress wealthy parents during open house tours. I shook my head in utter disbelief, thinking to myself that a place with all work and zero play was nothing more than a glorified prison. Returning to my room that night, I found my nosy roommate hanging around as usual. Keep my little secret game going, I sat down and scribbled angrily in my fake diary, filling the pages with even more made-up outrageous stories. I also vented about Kingsbury's absurd rules, Caroline's relentless bullying, and how deeply I despised this whole institution. It genuinely felt like we were trapped on campus just to be reprogrammed into the obedient robots our parents wished we were. But at least having Ian around made things bearable. Finishing up, I closed the notebook and hid it back inside my desk drawer. The next afternoon, Cass kept awkwardly hovering around, repeatedly attempting to start a conversation with me. She greeted me nervously and asked if everything was going well with me. I looked at her coldly, asking her to define what she meant by everything. She fumbled with her hands, asking how I was liking Kingsbury, and if anyone was giving me trouble or causing problems. Raising an eyebrow, I asked if there was any reason I should be having problems. Cass stammered nervously, insisting she hoped not, but explaining that I seemed a bit down lately. She added that as my roommate, she wanted me to know she was there for me if I ever needed a friend. It was glaringly obvious she had snuck another peek at my private diary, but I actually found her clumsy attempt to cover it up quite sweet and endearing, which made me smile softly. Cass then quickly shifted the topic to Caroline, revealing that Caroline used to be her former roommate. She admitted that while Caroline was mean now, she was not always like that, explaining that she only changed after getting into major trouble that almost got her expelled, before eventually moving to a different room. Cass added that she could not help but feel sorry for Caroline because she used to be genuinely kind to her. Cass seemed like a nice girl at heart, but I wanted to test if she could be completely honest with me. I looked her in the eye and told her that if she was truly my friend, she needed to tell me the truth about whether she had been reading my diary. Cass froze in surprise before sheepishly admitting that I had caught her. She pleaded with me to hear her out, confessing that my parents had actually paid her to spy on me and report all my actions back to them, and that she originally agreed because she thought she was helping me stay on the right path. However, Cass reassured me that she quickly realized I was not actually doing any of those awful things, so she ended up telling my parents only wonderful things about me. She earnestly promised that she had stopped working for them, admitting it was wrong of my parents to spy on me, and completely wrong of her to go along with, before sincerely asking for my forgiveness. I believed her sincerity, but I figured it would not hurt to use our newfound friendship for a good purpose. I urged Cass to pitch a fun holiday event to the faculty to bring some joy to this lifeless school. I reminded her that the teachers actually listened to her opinions, suggesting we could donate all the raised funds to a worthy charity. Pointing out how much she loved Kingsbury, I encouraged her to help everyone else fall in love with it too. Cass thought about it for a moment, her face lighting up with a big smile as she happily agreed to the plan. She held up her hand for an enthusiastic high five, but I just smiled and playfully left her hanging. Thanks to Cass's influence, our festive Christmas market became a reality out on the school grounds that evening. I had never seen so many bright, happy smiles across Kingsbury before. I even managed to arrange some last-minute musical entertainment for the crowd. To my surprise, Ian volunteered to take the stage, taking out his guitar and singing beautifully for everyone. He was usually such a quiet guy who avoided the spotlight, but that night, everything shifted. Surrounded by twinkling fairy lights, he gave off a total star quality that instantly turned him into everyone's huge crush, including mine. He flashed a warm smile at me from the stage as a crowd of girls swooned in front of him. Not only did we all have the absolute time of our lives, but we also managed to raise thousands of dollars to donate directly to a local children's hospital. A few afternoons later, while Cass and I were strolling past the croquet field, we caught sight of Caroline acting ridiculously flirty with Ian, twirling her hair around her fingers and lightly touching his arm. Naturally, she was trying to sink her teeth into him now that everyone realized how attractive he was. Thankfully, Ian looked completely uncomfortable and took a firm step back from spotting me watching. Caroline snapped, asking what I was staring. Cass stepped up immediately, telling her we were just watching her make an absolute fool of herself. Furious, Caroline asked how she dared to speak to her like that, but Ian casually chimed in, thanking Cass and mentioning that Caroline really was not taking the subtle hint. Speechless and thoroughly embarrassed, Caroline turned on her heel and stormed off. Looking at Cass and Ian, a warm feeling washed over me. I knew right then and there that I had finally found my true friends, and we shared a quiet, knowing smile. The following day, while I was sitting in class fully focused on my math exam, Caroline, who was seated right next to me, suddenly slipped a small note onto my desk. Leaning over, I read the handwritten message where she claimed she was so sorry and asked if we could be friends. I stared at the paper in total confusion, wondering why she would want to make peace in the middle of a big test. Suddenly, Caroline raised her hand high in the air and yelled out to our teacher, Mrs. Harris, accusing me of copying her exam answers. My jaw dropped in pure shock at this shameless lie. Mrs. Harris walked over calmly, picked up both of our test papers, and examined them closely side by side. I braced myself for the absolute worst, expecting to be dragged off to detention again. Instead, Mrs. Harris turned to Caroline, asking her what this nonsense was about, and pointing out that my answers looked nothing like hers, adding that it was not as if someone like me needed to cheat off her anyway. She handed my paper back with a reassuring smile and dismissed Caroline's baseless accusation. Walking out of the room later, Caroline still looked completely stunned by the outcome. I was so relieved Mrs. Harris had seen right through her little scheme. Unlike the rest of the strict staff at Kingsbury, Miss Harris was firm yet surprisingly kind. Knowing she was in my corner gave me a huge sense of relief, and Caroline stopped bothering me entirely. I felt safe opening up and confiding in an adult like her, and over time our relationship grew much closer, almost like friends. One afternoon, Mrs. Harris gave me a knowing smile and mentioned that she could tell just by looking at me that I had feelings for Ian. Surprised, I listened as she told me about a fun carnival happening in town the next evening, suggesting it was my perfect chance to make a move. Confused, I reminded her about the strict school curfew, but she simply pressed a finger to her lips with a quiet smirk and walked away. Even though sneaking out sounded like a risky idea, I desperately wanted to go on a real date with Ian. I whipped out my phone and texted him the invitation, and he immediately replied with a yes. With a teacher basically giving me the green light, I convinced myself that nothing could possibly go wrong. At 8:30 that night, I crept out of my dorm room and tried to quietly make my way down the dark hallway. But the moment I stepped into the corridor, a blinding beam from Mrs. Bell's flashlight caught me right in the eyes. She was absolutely furious, her face turning red with anger as she grabbed my arm and dragged me straight toward the principal's office. This was the second time I found myself standing in Mr. Hooper's office, which was way sooner than I had ever anticipated. The principal stared at me coldly, declaring that he had known from the very beginning that I would be a problem, accusing me of repeatedly breaking the rules and displaying a blatant disregard for authority. I tried to defend myself, assuring him that aside from trying to sneak out tonight, I never intended to break any rule, and promising that I had learned from my mistakes and would never repeat them. But Mr. Hooper cut me off, claiming my offenses were far from mine. He listed off drinking alcohol, distributing math cheat sheets, and even infesting my roommate's bed with bugs. My jaw dropped in complete shock. Those were the exact ridiculous stories I had written in my fake diary. How on earth did he know about them? He continued sternly, stating that they did not tolerate such delinquency at Kingsbury, and that I actually deserved to be expelled at that very moment. However, out of respect for my parents, he said I could choose to leave quietly of my own volition. I desperately tried to explain that those accusations were completely made up. So after some back and forth, he finally granted me 3 days to gather solid evidence to prove my innocence. When I stumbled back into my room around midnight, I noticed my desk drawer was standing slightly ajar, while Cass was fast asleep in her bed. I knew Cass would never betray me like this since we were genuine friends, but who else could have sneaked in? Picking up my fake notebook, my phone suddenly rang with a call from Ian. I did not want to unload all this heavy news over the phone, so I simply explained that someone was trying to push me out of school, and promised we would talk about everything later before hanging up. Cass stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly that she did not want me to leave either. I smiled quietly to myself, thinking that I definitely did not want to leave her either. Refusing to waste another second, I immediately set a plan in motion to catch the real snitch. This time, I wrote a brand new entry claiming I was planning a huge prank on Mrs. Bell. To track if anyone opened my desk, I set up a clever silent alarm system by jamming a tiny slip of paper into the edge of the drawer door. The next morning, the little paper alarm worked like an absolute charm. Walking over to my desk, I saw the tiny slip lying flat on the floor, proving that someone had taken the bait and opened my drawer. Now all that was left to do was catch them in the end. Right then, a knock sounded at the door, and opening it, I was completely shocked to see someone I never expected to see standing there. That evening, with my plan fully set in motion, Ian and I crouched quietly behind a wall near Mrs. Bell's office. Ian leaned in and whispered playfully that this was certainly an interesting first date, and I flashed a cheeky smile back, teasingly asking if it was not romantic. Suddenly, faint footsteps echoed down the hallway. I peeked around the corner, and my blood instantly boiled when I saw Mrs. Harris creeping down the corridor. The one teacher I actually trusted had completely betrayed me. Enraged, I was about to burst out and confront her directly when Ian quickly pulled me back, gently pressing his hand over my mouth to keep me quiet. My fierce expression softened instantly, a warm blush creeping onto my cheeks as I looked up into his eyes. Harris looked around the dim hallway impatiently before trying to push open Mrs. Bell's office door. As the heavy door creaked open, Ian pressed a button on his phone to play a blaring alarm sound. Startled out of her skin, Mrs. Harris tripped over her own feet and crashed hard onto the floor. Hearing the commotion, Mrs. Bell came sprinting down the hall out of breath as she demanded to know what was going on. Ian and I stepped out from our hiding spot while Mrs. Harris struggled to pull herself up. Mrs. Harris immediately pointed a finger at us, claiming she had arrived just in time to catch us sneaking around Mrs. Bell's office to play a prank on. I looked at her calmly, asking if she was sure about that because that was not what my phone camera had just captured. I handed Mrs. Bell my phone, and her eyebrows raised in surprise as she watched a clear video of Miss Harris sneakily snooping around her office. Furious, Miss Harris yelled that I was lying, insisting that I had written all about my prank in my diary, and claiming she was only there to catch me in the act. I confronted her directly, asking how she knew what was written in my private personal diary in the first place, explaining that I was merely messing with my roommate, and asking if she was trying to use those fake entries against me. Mrs. Harris turned to Mrs. Bell, desperately pleading with her not to believe a word I said, calling me a delinquent and claiming that writing about sneaking alcohol meant it was only a matter of time before I actually did it. Suddenly, Caroline's voice rang out from down the hall, asking Mrs. Harris if she just routinely made things up whenever nothing bad actually happened. Caroline walked into view alongside Mr. Hooper himself. Mrs. Harris's face turned completely ghost white at the sight of them. Caroline revealed to everyone that she had accidentally overheard Mrs. Harris encouraging me to sneak out after curfew, which shocked her because she had fallen for the exact same trap in the past. That was how Caroline had gotten disciplined while her boyfriend ended up expelled. Recognizing Mrs. Harris's sinister pattern, Caroline had knocked on my door earlier that day, so we could team up and put an end to her schemes once and for all. Mr. Hooper looked at Mrs. Harris in pure anger, demanding that she explain herself immediately. Panicking, Mrs. Harris tried to claim that the video was a deep fake created by us troublemakers to make her look bad. By that time, a crowd of curious students had gathered in the hallway. One by one, several students stepped forward to share identical stories about how Mrs. Harris had gained their trust, manipulated them into breaking school rules, and then blackmailed their wealthy parents into paying her massive sums of money to prevent their expulsion. Cornered by the overwhelming evidence and testimonies, Mrs. Harris finally broke down and admitted to all her corrupt actions. The following morning, Mr. Hooper summoned me to his office. Sitting across from him, I listened as he offered a sincere apology for completely misjudging my character. He admitted to being horrified upon discovering what Miss Harris had been doing right under his nose, adding that he might never have uncovered the truth if it had not been for my plan the previous day. Expressing his deep gratitude, he assured me that he would do whatever it took to repair the damage she had caused. Looking at him, I spoke up, telling him that I did not believe Mrs. Harris was the true root of the problem, but rather Kingsbury's overly harsh rule. Mr. Hooper raised his eyebrows in surprise, but I continued, explaining that while I knew he took great pride in those traditions, such strict rigidity was doing more harm than good. I pointed out that compliant students were becoming soft and submissive, while strong-willed kids were driven to constantly challenge authority, which was the exact environment Mrs. Harris had exploited. I added that most students here were truly exceptional, but their natural creativity was getting crushed under such iron discipline. Mr. Hooper listened to my words patiently, taking everything in. In the end, he stood up, warmly shook my hand, and wished me well. A week later, while sitting in our room, Cass and I received an official email titled "A Message from the Principal." Opening it up, we found a video of Hooper delivering a formal apology to all the students and families who had fallen victim to Mrs. Harris, announcing that she would never be allowed to teach at any school again. He also openly acknowledged the core issues plaguing Kingsbury, promising that going forward, the school would implement counseling-based solutions to support students through their problems, abolish several harsh punishments, make mental health services available to everyone, and actively encourage fun extracurricular activities. Things around campus truly changed for the better after that. Walking outside across the sunny school grounds, bright smiles and genuine liveliness had finally returned to these historic hallways. Spotting Caroline in the distance, I waved to her, and she flashed a warm smile and waved back, having stopped her rebellious acting out and actively patching things up with her old friend Kat. Now that all the dust has settled, I think I have actually fallen in love with Kingsbury and maybe with a certain someone too. Walking across the lawn, I approached Ian so we could finally set off on our long-awaited date, reaching down to softly hold his hand. Finally, my very first day at school had arrived, and I could hardly contain my excitement as I walked along the outdoor hallway. Before I get ahead of myself, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Hazel Palmer, and I'm 17 years old, and I'm a teacher. Yes, you heard it right. Not to brag or anything, but I am somewhat of a certified genius, which is how I graduated college so early. I was even offered a prestigious position in a university research project, but I rejected it to pursue my true dream of becoming a high school teacher. So here I was, not as a student, but as a real teacher, ready to fulfill my passion with a bright smile on my face. Since it was a special occasion, I wore my favorite green hoodie, which made me feel super cool. But then, completely out of nowhere, my path was blocked by a group of older boys throwing cheesy pickup lines at me. I rolled my eyes, thinking I had no time for this monkey business, and tried to brush past them. Unfortunately, they surrounded me and refused to let me go. I looked at them firmly, asking if they even knew knew who I was, intending to tell them that I was their new teacher. But before I could finish, one of them snatched the glasses right off my face. In an instant, everything went completely blurry. Panicking, I stumbled around blindly trying to grab them back, but someone shoved me roughly onto the hard floor, sending a sharp pain through my knee. Just then, a stern, deep voice cut through the noise. It was a boy named Ethan, and he fiercely ordered everyone to scram and give the glasses to him. The group scattered, and through my blurry vision, I saw the silhouette of my savior holding out a hand to help me up. He handed me my glasses, and as the world snapped back into focus, I profusely thanked him. But instead of saying anything, he just gave me a completely cold, distant look and walked off without a single word. I stared after him, thinking it was incredibly strange, but I had to shake it off. It was time to head to my very first class. Before heading to my classroom, I had to attend the morning staff meeting. I stood nervously beside the principal at the front of the room as he introduced me to the faculty. I had expected a warm, welcoming environment, but instead, my heart sank as I noticed the other teachers throwing me judging. They started whispering to each other, likely doubting my ability because of my age. Luckily, after the meeting ended, a young teacher named Rebecca approached me. She kindly welcomed me to the school and even gave me a helpful heads up about some of the notorious rebels I should watch out for. Leaving the meeting room, I stopped outside my assigned classroom, took a deep breath to gather my courage, and walked in. But the moment I finished introducing myself, the entire room erupted into chaos, sounding like a buzzing beehive. A boy with a mullet and a nose piercing loudly suggested that we should continue the lesson at the movie theater tonight, letting out a sharp whistle. I immediately realized this must be the troublemaker Lucas that Rebecca had warned me about. Before I could reply, a girl near the front scoffed loudly and told him that there was no way he would ever date someone who wore such a goofy hoodie. Another girl chimed in, laughing and asking who had allowed a cartoon-obsessed person to teach here. The whole class started booing and buzzing with mockery. I was completely stunned, having never expected such a harsh reaction. I tried to restore order by raising my hand and signaling for them to be quiet, but it was to no avail. Losing my patience, I finally snapped and angrily screamed at them to be quiet, threatening that I would give everyone a failing grade if they did not sit down. Thank goodness the threat worked and the room fell silent. I let out a quiet sigh of relief, thinking I had finally shown them who was in charge. But a new problem arose during the lesson. When I called a few students to the board, they just stood there scratching their heads in confusion. I felt deeply disappointed and wondered if there was anyone in this room who was actually here to study. I turned to the crowd and asked who the top student in the class was. Instantly, the students started rambling, and everyone turned their heads toward the back row, shouting Ethan's name. I looked toward the back and was surprised to see the very same boy who had helped me in the hallway earlier. However, he just stared back at me blankly, looking as if he did not recognize me at all. Feeling nervous, I began to stutter, calling on him and asking if he could come up to solve the mathematical formula on the board. In my anxiety, I completely tripped over my words, mispronouncing the word equation multiple times before finally getting it right. Ethan let out a cocky smirk and remarked that he supposed spelling was a bit too hard for a math person like me. The entire class burst into a roar of laughter at my expense. Geez, this guy was unbelievable. I quickly tried to regain my composure, looking down at the class gradebook to hide my embarrassment. I cleared my throat and called out the name of the second best student, Cassie Santiago. The name sounded exactly like my best friend from middle school. I scanned the room and noticed an arm reluctantly rising from a far corner. The girl kept her head lowered, clearly not wanting me to see her face. My eyes went wide with excitement as I realized it really was her. It felt so wonderful to see a familiar face in this chaotic place, but as I watched her hide away, I could not help but wonder why she was trying so hard to avoid me. That afternoon, while walking across the school car parking lot, I noticed Cassie and her crowd picking on a younger girl. The moment they spotted me, the group scattered, but I managed to stop Cassie. I looked at her, deeply hurt, and asked since when she had become a mean girl. Cassie looked irritated, snapping that it was none of my business and that I could report her to the principal if I liked. Then she strutted away, leaving me standing there completely confused. I could not understand how the sweet girl I used to know had ended up on such a dark path. Later that evening at home, I talked things over with my mom. She sighed and revealed a heartbreaking truth. Cassie's father had recently passed away in an accident, leaving her with her stepmother. The heavy grief must have been too much to bear, and she had put up this cold, reckless facade as a defense mechanism. My heart ached for her. It was just so incredibly sad. The next morning, I walked into the classroom with a new plan. To help Cassie feel included and give the class an academic boost, I announced a new policy. More homework, and anyone who did not finish would get minus points. On top of that, every lesson would come with a gift quiz during recess. I was bursting with excitement, while the students groaned in frustration. I then asked Cassie and Ethan to help tutor their classmate. However, when I called Cassie to the board, she froze. Strangely, she could not even solve a simple equation. At first, I thought she was just being rebellious, but during the test that recess, I caught her blatantly copying Ethan's answers as he pushed his paper toward her. A sudden realization hit me. Were all her straight A's just from cheating? To make things even more shocking, I later found out that Ethan was actually her stepbrother. After class, I spotted Cassie standing alone in front of a vending machine. I walked up to her, adopting a serious tone, and told her I knew the secret behind her top grade. I gently but firmly explained that high scores meant nothing when they did not come from her own hard work. Cassie looked offended and angry. She let out a sharp snort, telling me to butt out of her business, and bitterly added that I was about as much her friend as I was a proper teacher. As she walked away, I called out from behind, offering to tutor her in the library right after school. Without even turning around, she coldly muttered that she couldn't care less. Her words definitely stung, but I figured she was just trying to maintain her tough image. I still went to the library and waited for her, but she never showed up. No matter how much I tried to reach out, Cassie completely ignored me and kept right on cheating. During the midterm exam, she didn't even try to be sneaky anymore. She just blatantly snatched Ethan's test paper right in front of me. It broke my heart because she was my old friend, but as a teacher, I couldn't let it slide. With a heavy heart, I walked over and dismissed her test right then and there. I let out a long sigh as Cassie and the rest of the students sat there, completely dumbfounded. Later that same day, I was in the library searching for materials when I overheard a student named Sadie talking to Rebecca nearby. Sadie looked highly irritated, complaining that I was way too much for disqualifying Cassie's test, and asked why I couldn't just be understanding like Rebecca. Rebecca kept her voice calm, telling Sadie to cut me some slack because I was just doing what I thought was best. I stood there in absolute shock. So that was what my students really thought of me. After everything I had done to help them, all I got was bad-mouthing. At the same time, I felt grateful to Rebecca for defending me. It was no wonder the kids liked her so much. A few days later, while I was sitting in the teacher's room marking papers, the unexpected happened. Cassie, Lucas, and a few others walked in and actually asked me for extra lessons. I was surprised, but happily nodded, thinking they were finally starting to care about studying. But little did I know, it was just a cruel ruse to turn my days into a nightmare, and I was pretty sure Lucas was the mastermind. One morning, I almost fainted from horror when I opened my bag and found a massive ant nest inside. A couple of days later, I went to stand up only to realize my pants were stuck to the chair with chewing gum. I felt incredibly depressed, but fortunately, Ethan always showed up at the exact right time to help me, quietly chasing away the ants and cleaning the gum. He was becoming such a riddle to me. Despite his usual cold expression, he now defended me in class and even silently helped me carry my heavy textbook. Even though Ethan had been helping me at school, I never expected him to care about me that much outside of class. One afternoon, while I was working my part-time job at the car wash, I was shocked to see him walking onto the lot. Embarrassed to be seen covered in soap, I quickly hid behind a car, but Ethan spotted me and walked straight into my wash bay. He gently told me that he was there to see me and there was no need to hide, then took the water sprayer from my hands and started washing the vehicle for me. After my shift, Ethan walked me home. The atmosphere was so relaxed that I found myself opening up to him about my mom's failing health and how I took this exhausting job just to cover her hospital fee. Ethan listened gently and softly patted my shoulder to comfort me. This side of him was far different from his usual cold persona, and it felt truly heartwarming. Our walk was cut short when we noticed an elderly lady who seemed completely lost, so we offered to guide her home. And guess what? When we arrived at her house, the door opened and there stood Lucas. The notorious rebel looked absolutely shocked to see me. His tough guy act instantly vanished as he gently took his grandma's hands and helped her sit on the couch. As we sat and talked, I was surprised to see how much Lucas cared for his Nana. She was the only family he had left. I turned to him and softly said that I knew studying wasn't his thing, but asked if he had ever thought about how happy his grandma would be if he at least tried. Lucas silently looked down at the floor, while Ethan looked at me with genuine admiration. From that day on, a miracle happened. Lucas completely stopped causing me any mischief, and the other students followed his lead. They actually started paying attention, and soon they could even solve simple math problems by themselves. It was just baby steps, but it made me giggle with relief. Seeing my hard work finally bear fruit, I proudly set up a parent meeting to report on the students' progress. But halfway through my presentation, a giant photo of me cosplaying as Sailor Moon suddenly popped up on the screen. My heart dropped. Before I could explain, Cassie's stepmother stood up and angrily shouted how the school could dare let such a childish person teach her children. She stormed out, and everyone else followed. As the crowd cleared, I saw Cassie standing there, smirking cruelly. I felt utterly depressed. I thought I finally had my students on my side, but it turned out I never did. After that awful parent meeting, I sat alone in the quiet classroom, feeling completely crushed. Then came the absolute last straw. My phone buzzed with a message showing my mom's latest medical result. Reading the words, I completely broke down, burying my face in my hands as all my bottled up stress and sadness poured out in heavy tears. Suddenly, a warm hand rested gently on my shoulder. I looked up and turned around to see Ethan standing behind me. He leaned in closer, his usual cold gaze replaced with genuine worry, and softly asked what was wrong. Wiping my tears, I choked out that my mom's health had turned for the worse and she needed an urgent operation. Ethan looked at me sympathetically, telling me how sorry he was, and reassured me that everything was going to be okay, and that I needed to stay strong. I truly appreciated his comfort. Once I calmed down, we gathered our things to leave, but the classroom door wouldn't budge. It was firmly locked from the outside. It was another cruel prank from my student. We tried banging on the wood and screaming for help, but the school was deserted. Eventually, we gave up and sat on the floor, waiting for more. The quiet atmosphere had a strange way of making people open up, and for the first time, I got to know the real Ethan. Sitting against the wall, he quietly remarked that it seemed like both of us had problems with the families we love. I stopped sobbing and asked what his story was. He hesitated before confessing that he had a sister whom he knew I already ran into, that he really adored. But no matter how hard he tried, she always built a wall between them. I was amazed. This was the first time Ethan had ever talked about his personal life. He always wore that cold mask, but deep down he had his own struggles too. I became so absorbed in his story that I completely forgot we were trapped. Slowly, exhaustion caught up to me, and I gradually fell asleep right there against the wall. The next morning, the chatter of students entering the room startled me awake. As I opened my eyes, I realized with horror that my head was resting on Ethan's shoulder. Worse yet, countless phone cameras were pointing straight at us. A girl in the front row smirked, loudly telling everyone to check their phones to see what Ethan and I had been doing all night. Oh my God, I pulled away instantly, my heart hammering as I looked at my phone. Photos of us sleeping had been uploaded to the school website, and from the tight angle, it looked exactly like we were kissing. I tried to explain that we had been locked in, but the students just threw me disgusted look. I turned to Ethan, but he just stood there completely dumbfounded and silent. Before I could say more, a text from the principal popped up, coldly informing me that there would be an immediate hearing regarding an inappropriate relationship with a student. How was this even possible? With a heavy heart, I dragged my feet toward the principal's office. As I passed the schoolyard, the sound of familiar voices shouting caught my attention. I quickly leaned against the wall to eavesdrop. It was Ethan and Cassie. Ethan sounded furious, demanding to know why she had done this. Cassie replied with an arrogant sneer, snapping that she had told him to find my weakness. But he had come up with nothing. Ethan shot back that he had done everything he possibly could, but Cassie let out a harsh laugh. She asked why I was still around then, explaining that as long as I was teaching, I would keep messing up their cheating system, which meant her stepmother would chew her head off for being useless. I covered my mouth in pure shock. Everything finally connected: the ant nest, being locked in the room, and this morning's photo. Cassie had been pulling the strings this entire time, and Ethan was just her puppet, pretending to befriend me just to please his sister. I knew Cassie resented me, but finding out Ethan could be that heartless completely broke my spirit. Suddenly, Cassie turned and her eyes locked onto mine. We both froze in shock for a split second before I turned on my heel and ran away as fast as I could. I was still trying to process the painful betrayal when I walked in to see the school council glaring at me. The principal looked furious and stern, telling me I was an insult to the teaching profession and that they had no choice but to fire me. Everyone nodded in agreement. I was ready for the worst when suddenly Ethan rushed in. He shouted for them to stop, confessing that he had deliberately jammed the lock to get back at me for being too strict, but accidentally got stuck too. He firmly stated there was nothing going on between us. Everyone looked at him in shock. Thanks to his confession, I was cleared of all charges, while Ethan ended up with a week-long suspension. I wondered why he would protect me after everything. After such a long and exhausting trial, I drove around town to blow off some steam. Passing a clothes shop, I saw Cassie having a loud fight with a security guard. I pulled over and found out she had stolen a bracelet and was refusing to call her parent. The guard threatened to call the cops, so I immediately stepped forward as her teacher to bail her out. Cassie looked completely surprised, asking why I would help her. I didn't bother explaining myself and just left. Since that day, Cassie stopped attending the extra classes. After his suspension, Ethan returned to school with his usual distant, offhand attitude, barely acknowledging me as I walked past. I sighed, realizing I had no time to worry about those two. My mission now was to prepare my students for the upcoming finals and regain my prestige. Luckily, the rest of the class started taking studying seriously. One day, Lucas and a few others even crowded around my desk, eagerly asking me to help them solve some advanced math exercises. 2 weeks later, when the final results came out, my excited students rushed over to me in the hallway. One girl happily thanked me, saying that thanks to me, the exam questions were exactly the same as the ones I had shown them the other day, so it only took a blink to finish. I froze in confusion, What were they talking about? Before I could understand, the principal's voice suddenly crackled over the loudspeaker, summoning me to his office immediately. As I entered the principal's office, he angrily slammed down the math sheet I had taught in the extra class, furiously accusing me of leaking the final exam question. I pleaded that I was innocent, but he refused to listen and fired me on the spot. Desperate to find the truth, I rushed to the classroom and asked the students where they got that paper. They told me it was already on the table when they arrived. I felt crushed, assuming Cassie and Ethan had framed me, using his past remorse as a trap. I buried my face in my hands and wept. They had won. Unemployed and buried under my mom's hospital bills, my life became a nightmare. I worked full-time at the car wash by day and took night shifts at 7-Eleven. Beyond the measly wages, I had to endure my former students throwing rotten eggs and tomatoes at me at the car wash, alongside scornful comments that I didn't deserve to be a teacher. One evening at the hospital, Ethan suddenly rushed into my mom's room, grabbed my arm, and claimed he was going to clear my name. I yanked my arm away, furious and confused since I believed he was the one who ruined me. What game was he playing now? Still, with nothing left to lose, I reluctantly followed. He led me to the school's control room, where the principal was already waiting. On the monitor screen, we watched a live feed of Sadie standing nervously on the school stage. Ethan explained that Sadie was the one who had placed the math sheet on the table. My jaw dropped further when Rebecca walked onto the stage to join her. Sadie anxiously told Rebecca that she had distributed the test as planned but was terrified of getting caught. Rebecca calmly reassured her, saying that with Palmer fired, no one would dig it up, and she could finally reclaim her position as the student's beloved teacher. When Sadie panicked and threatened to confess everything to the principal, Rebecca smirked arrogantly, asking who would ever believe her. Before Rebecca could say another word, the principal flipped on the control room microphone, his stern voice booming through the auditorium speakers. I would. Rebecca froze in pure terror on the screen. Furious after weeks of humiliation, I didn't waste another second. I bolted out of the control room and rushed straight to the stage to confront Rebecca, asking her how she could betray me when I thought she was my friend. With a cocky attitude, she crossed her arms and told me to ask my phony self, claiming I only wanted the students to like me. I stood there shocked by her cruel jealousy, but before I could speak, Ethan stepped forward. He fiercely defended me, saying I had earned the students' respect with a pure heart, while Rebecca's love just came from buttering them up with lies, which ruined their attitude towards study. The principal, shaking with rage, stormed onto the stage, scolded Rebecca for her lack of ethics, and fired her on the spot. Though the principal apologized and offered my job back, the humiliation had completely drained me, so I refused and ran crying into the schoolyard. Ethan quickly caught up, gently grabbing my arms to apologize remorsefully, admitting he only tried to please Cassie but now realized he was hurting me. I nonchalantly told him I already knew. As I turned to leave, a group of students led by Cassie approached. To my surprise, Ethan whispered that Cassie had actually helped him bait Rebecca into confessing. Cassie held my hands, tearfully apologizing for her behavior and begging me to stay, while Lucas added that they had learned so much from me. Touched by their sincerity, I cried and nodded my agreement to stay. It had been a crazy term, but I was glad I didn't give up on my dream job. I later spoke with Cassie's stepmom, who hadn't realized her strict approach was causing a family rift. After an honest conversation, Cassie, Ethan, and their mom understood each other much better, and we all became close friends. A few months later, graduation day arrived. Watching my students, or rather my friends, prepare to pursue their dreams made me incredibly proud. During the ceremony, Ethan suddenly dragged me to a quiet corner, his eyes bright. He asked if we were finally no longer teacher and student, and when I confusedly agreed, he smiled and asked if I could still teach him one more thing: how to love me.